The Golden State Killer. Like and subscribe for more. For over 4 decades, he remained a ghost, a phantom who terrorized California communities, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would haunt investigators and victims for generations. He had many names: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. But the world would come to know him by one chilling moniker: the Golden State Killer. This is the story of one of America's most prolific serial predators, a man who committed at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986. But more than that, this is a story about persistence, about victims who never gave up seeking justice, and about how cutting-edge science finally unmasked a monster hiding in plain sight. His capture in 2018 would revolutionize criminal investigations forever, ushering in a new era of forensic genealogy. But before we get to that breakthrough, we need to understand the reign of terror that gripped California for more than a decade. Our story begins in the small agricultural town of Visalia, California, in 1974. Between April 1974 and December 1975, a mysterious burglar began breaking into homes, stealing personal items, and ransacking bedrooms. He became known as the Visalia ransacker. But this wasn't an ordinary burglar. He had a disturbing pattern. He would enter homes while residents slept, moving through darkened rooms with eerie familiarity. He'd steal coins, blue-chip stamps, family photographs, and women's identification. More disturbingly, he would rummage through women's underwear drawers, taking items that had no monetary value. The ransacker struck over 120 times in Visalia. Investigators noted his meticulous preparation. He seemed to know the layout of homes before entering, suggesting he'd been stalking his victims, watching their routines. On December 10, 1975, the crimes escalated dramatically. When journalism professor Claude Snelling heard a noise outside his home and went to investigate, he was shot and killed defending his daughter from an attempted kidnapping. The ransacker fled into the night. Then suddenly the crimes in Visalia stopped. But the terror was far from over. It had simply moved north. In June 1976, a new predator emerged in Sacramento and the surrounding areas of Northern California. Initially called the East Area Rapist, this attacker was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly proficient. His modus operandi revealed a calculating mind. He would stalk neighborhoods for weeks, sometimes months, learning residents' schedules, studying their homes, even calling them beforehand with heavy breathing or cryptic messages. He'd disconnect phone lines, unlock windows and doors in advance, and prepare escape routes. When he struck, usually in the middle of the night, he'd wake couples by shining a flashlight in their faces. His voice was distinctive, sometimes a forced whisper, sometimes a high-pitched, almost adolescent tone. He'd separate couples, binding them with shoelaces he'd brought or found in the home. He'd stack dishes on the husband's back, threatening to kill everyone if he heard them crash. The attacks were brutal and prolonged, sometimes lasting hours. He'd ransack homes while victims lay bound and terrified, stealing money, jewelry, and personal items. He'd eat food from their refrigerators, a ghoulish pause in his crimes. And he'd make chilling statements that suggested deep-seated rage. "I hate you. I hate you, Bonnie." Investigators would spend years trying to identify this mysterious Bonnie. Between 1976 and 1979, the East Area Rapist attacked at least 50 women across Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, Davis, and other Northern California communities. The entire region lived in fear. Gun sales skyrocketed. Women were afraid to sleep in their own homes. Community meetings were packed with terrified residents demanding answers. And then once again, the attacks in Northern California stopped. In October 1979, the violence escalated beyond anything investigators had seen before. In Goleta, near Santa Barbara, the attacker began murdering his victims. On October 1, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning were shot and killed in Goleta. 3 months later, Lyman and Charlene Smith were bludgeoned to death in their Ventura home. The killer had evolved from rapist to murderer. Southern California investigators, unaware of the East Area Rapist's crimes up north, dubbed this new killer the original Night Stalker, a name coined to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, who would terrorize Los Angeles in 1985. The original Night Stalker's attacks in Southern California showed the same meticulous planning as the East Area Rapist. He stalked victims, learned their routines, and struck with precision. But now he was killing. In August 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington, newlyweds, were bludgeoned to death in their Dana Point home. In February 1981, Manuela Withoon was raped and murdered in her Irvine home while her husband was hospitalized. In July 1981, Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were killed in Goleta. Each crime scene revealed the same signature elements: ligatures, evidence of ransacking, theft of personal items, and the feeling that the killer had been watching for weeks or even months. The final confirmed attack came in May 1986. 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was raped and bludgeoned to death in her family's Irvine home while she was alone. It was a crime that would remain unsolved for over 30 years. Reflective pause. And then silence. The attacks simply stopped. For years, investigators wondered, had he died? Been imprisoned for another crime? Simply moved away? The question haunted everyone who had worked these cases. For decades, these crimes remained separate investigations. Northern California agencies hunted the East Area Rapist. Southern California agencies pursued the original Night Stalker. The idea that they might be the same person seemed almost too terrible to consider. One predator responsible for such a vast crime spree across the entire state. The breakthrough came in 2001 when DNA technology had advanced enough to test evidence from both crime series. Criminalist Paul Holes, who would become instrumental in solving the case, ran DNA from an East Area Rapist case against DNA from the original Night Stalker murders. The results were shocking. It was a match. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. One predator had terrorized California for over a decade, committing crimes across hundreds of miles, adapting and escalating his violence over time. This revelation reinvigorated the investigation. But still, no match appeared in CODIS, the National DNA Database. The killer had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection, or he'd committed his crimes before DNA databases existed. As the 2000s progressed, the case became cold again despite the DNA link. Investigators continued working, but leads dried up. Then, in 2013, writer Michelle McNamara became obsessed with the case. She coined the name Golden State Killer to encompass all his crimes, and her articles and subsequent book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, brought renewed public attention to the case. McNamara died suddenly in 2016 before the killer was caught, but her work had reignited public interest. Meanwhile, Paul Holes and other investigators were exploring a revolutionary new technique: forensic genealogy. The method was straightforward but had never been used in a criminal investigation before. Instead of just searching law enforcement databases for an exact DNA match, investigators would upload the killer's DNA profile to public genealogy websites like GEDmatch, where people voluntarily upload their DNA to find relatives. The idea was that even if the killer himself hadn't submitted his DNA, perhaps a distant cousin had. From there, investigators could build family trees, working backward through generations to identify potential suspects. In late 2017, Holes and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer, working with genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch. What came back were several distant familial matches, people who shared enough DNA to be third or fourth cousins of the killer. Ray Venter got to work building family trees, tracing ancestors back through the 19th century, then forward through generations of descendants. It was painstaking work, requiring expertise in both genetics and genealogy, analyzing birth records, death certificates, census data, and family histories. After months of work, the family trees began to converge on a single family line in Northern California. From there, investigators identified several potential suspects and began the process of elimination. They needed to find men of the right age, who'd lived in the right areas at the right times. One name emerged: Joseph James D'Angelo. Joseph James D'Angelo was a former police officer. He'd worked for the Exeter Police Department from 1973 to 1976 during the Visalia ransacker crimes, and then for the Auburn Police Department from 1976 to 1979 during many of the East Area rapist attacks. He'd been fired from the Auburn PD in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer, items chillingly similar to tools used in the attacks. After being fired, D'Angelo had worked as a mechanic for a grocery distribution center until his retirement. He was married, had 3 daughters, and was living a quiet life in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb near where many of the East Area rapist attacks had occurred. After being fired, D'Angelo had worked as a mechanic for a grocery distribution center until his retirement. He was married, had 3 daughters, and was living a quiet life in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb near where many of the East Area rapist attacks had occurred. To confirm their suspicions, investigators needed D'Angelo's DNA, but they needed to obtain it legally without alerting him. The surveillance began. In April 2018, investigators followed D'Angelo to a hobby store. After he left, they retrieved items he'd touched, hoping to collect his DNA. When that didn't yield enough material, they waited for another opportunity. Days later, they collected DNA from his car door handle and, more definitively, from a tissue he'd discarded in his trash. The lab results came back. It was a match. After 44 years, they had their man. On April 24, 2018, at around 3:30 in the afternoon, officers surrounded D'Angelo's home. When 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo emerged, confused and elderly, officers took him into custody. "I have a roast in the oven," he reportedly said, seeming bewildered. The frail, grandfatherly figure before them bore little resemblance to the violent predator who terrorized California decades earlier. The arrest made international headlines, news that the Golden State Killer had finally been caught, and the revolutionary method used to find him captivated the world. For the victims and their families, it was a moment they'd waited decades to see, even though many hadn't lived to witness it. For law enforcement, it was vindication after decades of frustration. Paul Holes, who retired just days after the arrest, had worked the case for 24 years. The answer wasn't in the database, it was with the family, he later reflected. Joseph James D'Angelo was charged with 13 counts of murder and numerous other crimes. Due to statutes of limitations, he couldn't be charged with most of the rapes, a bitter reality for many survivors who'd carried their trauma for decades. Initially, D'Angelo pleaded not guilty, but in June 2020, facing overwhelming DNA evidence and the testimony of survivors, he changed his plea to guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The sentencing hearing in August 2020 was extraordinary. Over several days, survivors and family members of victims addressed D'Angelo in court, confronting the man who'd destroyed their lives. Their statements were heartbreaking and powerful, stories of lives forever altered, of fear that never fully disappeared, of loved ones lost. Gay and Bob Hardwick spoke of the night they were attacked in 1978. Jane Carson Sandler described her assault and the decades of trauma that followed. Chris Pedretti read a statement on behalf of her murdered mother, Charlene Smith. The daughter of murder victims Keith and Patrice Harrington spoke of growing up without her uncle. D'Angelo, sitting in a wheelchair and rarely looking up, showed little emotion. When he finally spoke, he offered a brief, hollow apology. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry for everyone I've hurt." Judge Michael Bowman sentenced him to 11 consecutive life terms, without possibility of parole, plus 15 life terms, plus 8 years. D'Angelo will die in prison. Pause, transition to conclusion. But the Golden State Killer case's impact extends far beyond one man's sentence. The use of forensic genealogy opened a new frontier in criminal investigations. Since 2018, the technique has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases across America, bringing closure to families who'd waited years or decades for answers. It also sparked important debates about privacy, DNA databases, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting genetic information. These conversations continue today as the technology becomes more sophisticated and widely used. For the victims and their families, D'Angelo's arrest and conviction brought a measure of closure, though the scars remain. Many survivors have spoken about finally feeling safe, no longer looking over their shoulders, no longer wondering if he'd return. As for Michelle McNamara, who'd worked tirelessly to bring attention to the case, her widower Patton Oswalt was present at the sentencing. Her book's title proved prophetic in a way she never intended. I'll Be Gone in the Dark. The Golden State Killer believed he'd disappear into history, unpunished and unnamed. Instead, he's now identified, imprisoned, and a symbol of how tenacity, technology, and the courage of survivors can bring even the most elusive predators to justice. The Golden State Killer is gone, but he's no longer in the dark, and that perhaps is the most fitting end to this story. Like and subscribe for more crime stories and comments where you watching from.